a dog in the background? That is my Rosie. She, there's activity across the street and she's quite interested in what's going on over there. So, so I think, Emily, we're going to turn off the microphones and video and then we'll have a break and we'll undo everything so that you can ask some questions. And as well, we're going to go into breakout rooms in just a few minutes. So next. So there's basically in this section, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the 5 sessions are about. Today, we're going to talk specifically about fire ecology and the various California habitats and some considerations based on your particular habitat. And it sounds like we are all over. So I'm glad that I included all of them. I did mention a bit about Butte County, but you'll see the map and you can take a look at what's relevant for you. Next slide. So this is what you have to look forward to. After today, the following session is a very experienced master gardener, Brent McGee, who's going to be talking about defensible space landscaping. And he'll be drawing on resources from CAL FIRE, as well as Sonoma County Master Gardeners. And this is something that this is the one area that we have done a bit of work and presentations with. So that'll get more into the particulars about the most recent codes and laws regarding your landscape. The next session following is going to be focusing on the soil and how to restore the soil, how to protect the soil from erosion, and looking at a variety of mulch. Ann Osborne and Candace Boggs, both very experienced master gardeners, are going to be talking about that. Following that, we have Cheryl Kozad, very experienced master gardener in this area, and she is going to be talking about how to convert your landscape to be more fire safe. So there's plant considerations, spacing considerations. You'll see that each session, there's going to be a thread that kind of relates to the next topic. And then our final session is going to have to do with yard maintenance, like all the things you've got that new landscape in there. What are some things that you need to do to maintain it? And as well, what are some things to think about in terms of caring for the trees and land after a fire, and some important information to know about that. So this is what each week we'll be talking about and who will be sharing that with you. Next slide. So I'd like you to start by thinking about, first of all, it sounds like coming from a variety of areas that we all have different experiences with wildfires. You may have had direct experience with it, or perhaps you saw the smoke or ash, or it was around you, but you haven't had perhaps the firsthand experience. But I'd like you just to take a moment to think about this, and then we're going to go into a breakout room to talk about it. What have been your experiences with wildfires? What do you already know about fire and plants? What's your extent of your knowledge? What have perhaps you've researched or learned more about? And what do you hope to learn over the next few weeks? If there's something that in particular you really want to have addressed, I'll pass that on to my peers and we will make sure that we can talk about it. So that's something that we want to be sure in this first session, that we will meet your needs and what it is that you hope to gain. The picture that you see there is the day of the Paradise Fire, and it was my firsthand experience with being in that situation. From a distance we see fire, but that was quite a day, and for most of us here in the area, and I'm sure that it's not something that we hope will happen again soon. So we are going to move on into breakout rooms now. And I think we're going to have 5 rooms. So we'll do a random assignment to the group. So if you could just take a few minutes to share, we'll be in the groups for about 5 to 6 minutes, and just share what have been some of your experiences. Okay, welcome back. So anything that came out in terms of what your goals are, what you really hope to learn over the course of the semester or the 5 weeks, let me know. Anybody want to share as we're coming out of the breakout rooms?
Oh, I'll share. I'll break the ice.
Okay, break the ice.
So I shared that we lost our home in the fire in Paradise, but there is one area in our yard, and we have 1/3 of an acre where I have that didn't totally burn, and I have 2 dogwood trees, a persimmon tree, and a holly tree, and a crepe myrtle. Well, one of the dogwoods, several people have just told me, just take it out. And it's old. It must be at least 60 or 70 years old. And it's burned on one side, and some of the bark is damaged. And we trimmed it, and now it's all these branches are starting to come out, and I think it might be okay. You know, somebody told me put linseed oil on it. I go out and hug it and I want that tree to make it. The second dogwood tree is much bigger and doesn't look like it's much at risk, but I'm interested in caring for trees in particular after the fire.
Okay.
And the other thing I shared was I took the regenerative gardening. I took several classes, which one of them you taught, Joyce.
Oh.
And there was a lot of discussion about not pulling weeds, and I'm really struggling with that because there's a whole lot of weeds right now, and I don't know if I really got that. I get the biological, the science behind it.
Yeah.
But how do you balance how your yard looks versus not doing digging your weeds up? So those are the 2 things that I'm pretty interested in learning more about.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Anybody else have things that came out that you would hope to learn that you're not sure if it's going to be covered, but we would want to make sure we address? We'll definitely be talking about post-fire care of trees, so we'll talk more about that. Okay, well then, Emily, I think we'll go to the slideshow. Thanks again, Melissa, for sharing. So, next slide. The first section we're going to talk about is fire ecology, and specifically for this section, I pulled from the Fire Recovery Guide and the Sonoma Master Gardener website. So we'll send those links, as I said, the PDF of the guide, as well as the articles from Sonoma County Master Gardener's website, if you haven't seen them already. Next slide. Okay, so fire ecology. And when we first talked about this particular topic for this session, I wasn't exactly sure what they were talking about. In our training, we learned about fire and how it works and how it starts and the ignition, and watched a lot of videos of fires and what causes them to start on houses in particular. But as we research more, it makes a lot more sense. This fire ecology has really to do with just the conditions that allow themselves, and it's like a combination of things that come together in order for fire to happen. We live, as probably most of you know, in a Mediterranean climate. That means that we have these very wet, cool winters. We get a lot of rain, which means lots of vegetation. And then we get a very hot and dry, and they're getting longer summers. So we're over time, we have this, we increase the amount of vegetation, and there was a spell there where we had, of course, the drought, and that increased the problems with the low humidity, the fuel load in terms of fire fuel was just getting greater and greater. So we have this situation just because of our climate that we're already kind of, it was conducive for these situations. Fire, that we have to know this, and this is something we'll talk a little bit more about, is part of the natural cycle of decomposition. If there isn't enough rain for that vegetation to decompose, fire will come along and basically bring that tinder vegetation down. Next slide. So there are basically 3 risk factors that can make these conditions worse. And I had this class this summer. I was actually taking some of these photos that you'll see. This is Butte Creek Canyon along the creek itself. And what you can see when you're going up the canyon is south-facing slopes are definitely hotter. Because they face south, they tend to have less vegetation. The north-facing slopes, however, which are shaded from the sun and the heat, have a denser vegetation. So we have that topographical situation, as well as we get these east-west canyons. And I lived in Southern California for a bit, and so we'd get these Santa Ana winds, the San Gabriel winds, basically the winds coming from east to west, and they come through the canyons with great force. So when that's one of the factors that when all these conditions come in meet at some point, this is when we tend to have some very severe fires. Next slide. The other has to do with weather. A great risk factor again. And because we had the drought perhaps about 4 years ago, I believe, we had a 5-year drought. And then we get these high winds, which are high to low pressure systems. And so the winds have been getting increasingly stronger. We have this low humidity factor. If you remember the conditions just prior to the Paradise campfire, we had very, very, very low humidity. We had a ton of fuel. We'd had heavy rains in the spring. And so there was a lot of vegetation. And then as the summer, it dried out and we just had like matchsticks everywhere. And then we had the wind. And the wind tends to happen in the fall, around October. It is when we get the strongest winds coming from the Great Basin. And we can talk a little bit more about the conditions that are leading to that. Next slide. The third risk factor has to do with the vegetation itself. And again, the fuel built up from years, fire suppression, which we've been trying to do fire prevention, and there's lots of grass, lots of dead plants, ladder fuel. So we have certain trees, pine trees, and they tend to be growing in the understory of the larger, more native trees. And they just basically create the conditions that make the likelihood or chance of a great severe fire even higher. Areas that were chaparral tend to be more prone for burning, as well as the chaparral areas of California have been where a lot of new housing developments have been moving. So basically people are moving into areas that were used to be wildlands and used to be uninhabited. So if a fire happened, it wasn't going to impact people's homes. Next slide. So some important things to know about California in particular is that it is home to more native plants than anywhere else in the US. We have this huge diversity. And in our past, and up until more recent times, fire was part of the regeneration. So there are the plant you see there, Matilia poppy, for example, will only regenerate and reseed if it's in a fire. So we know that there are quite a few plants because over time, the native plants in California have adapted to fire. That was a very natural part of the cycle. and it's actually contrary to what most of us think, that the fire destroys plants. A lot of plants have developed over time and evolved to be able to withstand fires. So most native trees, as it says, are fire adapted. And they actually need that fire in order to reseed or to regenerate or germinate. Next slide. So another factor that is playing into fire ecology in California has to do with climate change. And I know this is something that we all hear about, but for California in particular, it is definitely a very threatening problem. I didn't include a map that I came across, but it actually shows that because of the increase in the snowmelt and because of the increase in temperature of the ocean, it's basically forcing the high pressure ridge to push the rainfall that we used to get north. And so we're getting longer, drier summers. And as well as, if you remember the last few summers, it's been well over 100 degrees for a majority of the time in the summertime, which is quite a change. So in that last drought that we had just a few years back, more than 100 million trees in California died over that period of time. And of course, all those dead trees are increasing the fuel for fires. So we had all the conditions, definitely. Next slide. Even in the Sierras, they're actually seeing an increased death of giant sequoias, which are very fire resistant. So there's a huge concern about another drought happening, because in particular in the Sierras, it could completely change the ecosystem there. If those new seedlings that have now sprouted after the fire, if there's another drought and they're not able to grow to a size that can withstand fire, then we're basically going to lose those forests. So the issue has a lot to do with, again, this is in the news quite often, but rapidly melting Arctic seas influences the precipitation that we get here in California. So what they're seeing is that actually even our zone, our USDA zone, changing over time. We're basically getting warmer and the zones are moving north from the south, which means that our overall average temperatures are warmer, and we're seeing fewer days of cold temperatures. So those are some concerns that are definitely going to influence the risk of fire. Next slide. So I just wanted to take a stop here, and maybe we can unmute before we move on to the habitats piece and see if people have some questions that we can address. And Cheryl, anybody who has information, feel free to share. If you want to unmute yourselves, we'll just take a minute just to see if you have questions. So I don't know if you see the reactions down there on the bottom of your screen. It's on the far right. How many of you, if you want to use that, if you don't want to unmute, how many of you this is new information for?
Some of it was new to me. Like, I didn't understand when you explained that the rising ocean temperature created a change in the way the rain
the
is
high
dispersed.
ridge.
I didn't get that part, so that was new for me.
Yeah, that was new for me as well. It's like, it made sense then, because I did take a weather class last fall, and understanding how the flow and how the rain, basically the fronts run along that ridge and how that influences our weather made a lot more sense. Anybody else have questions? You can also list them in the chat.
Do you see that we would perhaps do more controlled burning than we ever have because of the fact that our summers are longer and there's more growth that we need to control? Or is that kind of beyond the question of this class, I guess?
Actually, that's coming up next, and
Okay.
habitats. We're going to talk about controlled burns. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, let's go back to the slideshow. If you have questions, just pop them into the chat as well. So California habitats, we thought it would be helpful just to think about, well, partly why California is so diverse and why we have so many native plants. Next slide. So I love this map. I love maps anyway, but this one especially, because it just shows the range of the vegetation and the various habitats that we have in California. It is from the Native Plant Society Guide, which I hope you can get your copy. But I think it's really important to pay attention. If you look at just even visually looking at the map, look at the range of zones, agriculture in particular, the entire Central Valley. The dark areas are towns or cities, and you can see way up at the very top end of that large Central Valley of agriculture is where Butte County sits. We're kind of there at the base of the montane and the broadleaf woodland forests. So understanding our habitats and where you are, and it sounds like we have people from all over. So we have folks in the Bay Area, north of Butte County and Corning. And so you can see, we're going to go into a few of those different habitats, but you can just see the variety that we're dealing with here. Look along the coast in the south. We've got lots of chaparral. And then that warm desert, we have cold desert, we have everything here in California, partly because of our geographic location, but we have quite a range to deal with. And if you think about in the past few years where the fires have been, they've been throughout the state. We've had them from north to south, and areas where there was only chaparral, as well as areas where we have urban forests, we have broadleaf forests. We had, even on the coast, I lived in Monterey County for 30 years, and there were lots of fires in Big Sur, which is right along the coast there. So because of our diversity and this huge variety of ecosystems and habitats, it's important to know what yours is in order to have a better idea of how to manage that land, and try to establish and preserve as much of the native vegetation that we have. So next slide. So these are the different California habitats. And as you can see, some of them definitely don't relate to us. I think we can mark out the coastal for the most part and the desert situations, but we definitely have riparian forest and shrubland. We definitely have broadleaf woodlands and forests, chaparrals. We have the annual and perennial grasslands and vernal pools and meadows. So we have a mix. And so understanding those habitats, and I didn't go into it on this slideshow, but within the Native Plant Society Guide, they have a lot more detail about consideration, first of all, characteristics, but also considerations for fire prevention. So that's something, depending on your particular habitat, that you're going to want to pay attention to. And again, I'll send you that PDF version of the guide so you can look at it sooner than later. So let's go on to the next slide. Something that has definitely had an impact and changed, and you're hearing more and more about this in the news, is the shift in practices from California Native American practices. As we know, the Native Americans used fire to prevent larger, more severe fires. So there was often this annual burning, as Anne referred to as controlled burns. They were smaller fires. They just knew, and this was going on for thousands of years. As Europeans and Americans moved in and shifted that practice to be more suppressive, basically to prevent fires, we started to see an increase in, first of all, non-native grasses, which are not as fire resistant, so more exotic grasses. Trees left in the understory and shrubs. So it was very crowded and dense. So when a fire came in, there was lots of fuel, as opposed to having less fuel, like thinning of forests as well as grass burning. So these controlled burns would definitely need public support. In some cases, people don't like the smoke, or they see the smoke and they're not sure what's going on. But more and more, one of the practices that we want to see an increase is controlled burns. This time of year, Big Chico Ecological Reserve has been conducting some controlled burns. So we're shifting. In fact, I just saw a message this morning, the Yurok tribe up in northwest California is having a controlled burn workshop. And the Yurok tribe is going to be basically teaching the public, if you're interested, through the Native Plant Society. So I think there's going to be a shift. People are more aware now that what we've been doing is not helping the situation, it's contributing to the problem. What they did find is that where there was the highest survival of trees, they thought, well, would logging be a solution to the problem? And they found, when they looked at areas that have been slashed and logged and just left debris, that the fires were actually worse. The better situation was when the forests were thinned and the grass was burned. So that's where the trees also survive, because we do need the trees. So we want to see how we can make that work. And I love this picture and this slide from the Native Plant Society guide, but I think it goes back to what you were talking about, Melissa, and that had to do with the nature, just the natural recovery is something that we want to try to bring back. And I well, we'll talk about your dogwood trees after. So let's go ahead into the next slide. So good land management, these are recommendations from Native Plant Society Guide, is to know your habitat first and foremost. Get familiar with the characteristics. After the fire, we know that we have an increase in invasive plants. We're seeing an increase in broom and tree of heaven and Himalayan blackberry. And so knowing that certain things as well are going to come back after the fire, that it's quite natural. So knowing what is invasive and not native, and knowing what is native is going to be important wherever you are. Within Butte County, some of the areas that we see here are the grasslands, the savanna and chaparral areas. We also have our woodland areas. And in most cases, oaks are very fire resistant. And so we want to try to increase the native plants, native trees to our area, because they've evolved to be able to withstand fire. Next slide. And we're just going to kind of close with this message. I think, again, from the Native Plant Society, I love that guide. It's such a great, valuable resource. But I think that nature really does know best. And in many cases after the fire, we got lots of questions and a lot of people trying to figure out what is safe. What do I do now? You know, our land is covered with ash. In some cases, the soil is removed because of the contamination of the soil. And so what can we do? And the thing that you have to remember is that in nature, the earth has figured out how to recover from the things that we do to it. And so what we want to be sure is to pay attention to that. And again, I think it's just having faith that nature is going to take its course. As you can see, I love this photograph as well, because you can see that even after the fire, even after the burn, the tree still is going to come back to life. It's learned how to adapt to the environment that we're in. Next slide. So I just wanted to remind you of what we have coming up. Next week, it's going to be it's pretty intense. There's a lot of information on defensible space in your landscaping. Following that, we'll have a talk about soil and mulches, and then landscapes, and then yard maintenance and post-fire care. If there are things in particular you're not sure if it's going to be addressed, please send myself or Emily an email. And the next slide, I think, is where we have our contact information. So we have a voicemail. You can leave messages, or you can also email questions and they'll forward it to us. I think we can end the slideshow and we can open up for any questions that people have, again, or any things in particular that I can pass on to folks that we want to make sure we address. You can unmute yourselves, I think. So hopefully you got an introduction and just kind of like some things to think about and considerations to set the stage for what we're going to get into, the nitty-gritty. Anybody have any questions or any other things that you want to make sure we address? I've got yours, Melissa, right here on my pad.
Thank you. So on that map that you showed that said the different zones.
Yes.
What is Paradise?
You know, I tried to blow it up as big as I could. I'm going to send it to you online, but it looks to me like you are, because it also gives, I'm going to show you. It's got also the elevation. It's right in here. Yeah, so I tried blowing it up online because I have the PDF, and it looked to me as though it is the broadleaf woodland and forest.
Okay.
Yeah, and it also gives the elevation range for each of the areas in the details. So I take a look at that. I'm going to send the PDF to you so you can look at it right away. You don't have this guide?
I don't have it.
Okay, you definitely. So for sure, we'll send you the PDF version, but if you'd actually like the book, I may have you send me your addresses so I can mail it to you.
Okay.
Okay, because I have some copies. We would give them out in person. We planned to last year when this class was happening, but things change.
Mm-hmm.
So any other questions? Feel free, Cheryl, to pitch in.
Okay, well, I can answer Melissa's question about pulling the weeds.
Oh, good, thank you.
Okay, so the regenerative ag kind of thing is, the whole idea is you want to keep all those little microorganisms that are surrounding the roots in the soil. So, but you don't want the weeds sucking up all your moisture and taking over. So you hack off the weeds to ground level, mulch it heavily, put newspaper or cardboard or something over it and throw on mulch. Or the other thing you can do is to just put on some compost or something like that and seed it with a cover crop.
I have a cover crop going.
Right.
And it looks like a bunch of weeds. It looks terrible.
Well, yeah, because it's about time to hack down the cover crop and let all those things go back into the soil.
Okay, so just chop
when
them.
the cover crop is, no, I won't go into the whole thing, but you know, your cover crop's going to flower right now. So before it goes to seed, you want to hack it down and let those things go back into your soil. And that also gives you a mulch layer that'll help with some weed suppression.
Okay, I'm experimenting in this one area. So I'll do that. So I should just hack them off at the base, but leave the roots in there.
Yes.
Well, for the weedy weeds, you don't want to come back, you can hack them off at the base. For your cover crop, if you want to leave it a little bit, like hack them off at 4 to 6 inches or something like that, and they'll grow some more to make more green mulch for your bed.
Okay.
Yeah. I found that cardboard and mulch works really good. I had Bermuda grass, a patch in my garden, and I kept pulling it, kept growing back. I finally put cardboard and about 2 inches, 3 inches of wood mulch, and it suppressed it really well, even Bermuda grass.
Wow.
Yep.
'Cause-
Yeah, it does. They kind of just get scrawny and starved, and then they try to find the edges of the cardboard, but you can kind of pull them out. They're not very well developed or very well rooted then.
Yeah.
Yes, by the way, Bermuda grass did make it back through the fire.
Yes, it did.
Any other questions that folks have? You can feel free to unmute yourself. Any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I wanted to say, one of the other things that made it back is asparagus.
Oh,
I was surprised about that. The asparagus, the whole vegetable garden got burned, but asparagus is just growing.
Nice.
yeah. I've heard from a friend whose place burned in Paradise, and she's been up there, and there are plants growing that she's never seen. She doesn't know what they are. So there are some exotic plants that will come back after a fire. So in the Native Plant Guide, they also identify some of those plants. So take a look at that area. So following this session, I'm going to send you, first of all, the article on fire ecology from Sonoma County Master Gardener. Also send you the PDF version of the Native Plant Society Guide. And if you want, I can take a snapshot picture of the fire escaping, which is something that will be talked about as well. I know that a couple of the speakers coming up have referenced that book as well and attended his actual trainings that he's done up in Paradise. So,
Might want to send out your slides as well.
oh yeah, you'll get a PDF of the slides as well. Yes.
Right.
And yeah, I hope this was helpful. And yeah, I'm really looking, I will be here each week, even though we'll have a different speaker, but as the peer leader for the class, I'll continue to be here and try to make sense of things with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce.
All right, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.